Hello again, David Atkinson here. We're going to continue this journey towards developing effective and robust procurement strategies by considering how can we create the right sort of culture within our organization. So if you're a chief procurement officer or another procurement leader, what can you do to create the right culture in the organization? And part of this is kind of recognizing where we start from. And I'm going to go through a model now as a 5-phase model that takes us from what we call unstructured reactive to systemic. And this was devised by Michael Simmons back in the 90s, and it's a really good way of identifying or kind of diagnosing where we are and how far we are on this journey to having a procurement organization that's working really well and as intended. So there are 5 phases. The first one is labeled phase 0, and it's unstructured reactive, and it's labeled phase 0 because it's often the status quo. So this is kind of where we are, where we start from. And there are behaviors and methods that are characteristics of each of these phases. So in phase 0, the behaviors is that there's often an overwhelming emphasis on just doing stuff. There's a lot of firefighting that goes on. There's not a lot of direction. There's not much in the way of strategy. And because we're human beings, there's a lot of jostling for position and influence and status. A lot of blaming goes on in these environments. It's kind of a chaotic environment. If there are any methods in existence, we tend to focus on the symptoms and not the root causes. There may be, if it's significant enough a problem, we might have a hit squad that will go in and try and busy away trying to fix that significant problem. So hopefully none of you are working in an organization in that particular phase. And I think if we've got us procurement professionals, then we tend to work in organizations that are pretty mature in their practices and their expectations of procurement. So I think almost all of our organizations are better than that. Phase 1 is where we're starting to make progress, and it's still largely reactive, but there's a bit of structure around it. And the behaviors there, we'll sometimes see a recognition of customers, maybe internal customers. There's a focus on accountability and responsibility, so leaders are held to account, at least to some degree. And if I'm going to come on to W. Edwards Deming, Principles of Management, and one of the things that he thinks is incredibly important is leaders need to work on driving out fear in their organizations, because fear begets bad behavior. So this is in phase 1, we're starting to see the beginnings of enlightened leadership driving out fear. So the methods, well, we're starting to see performance indicators being implemented, but usually with arbitrary targets. There might be some performance reviews. There might be from time to time a question around maybe once a month, well, how are we doing? Are we making progress? And we may put more structured corrective actions in place where we've got repeat problems. So that's phase 1. Phase 2 has all of that in phase 1, but it goes further still. This is much more proactive. And the behaviors that characterize phase 2 is there's a much more intensive customer focus. And that's quite a leap from recognizing we've got some stakeholders here to working very, very proactively and diligently in and ensuring those relationships are working as intended. There's more long-term goals, so we're not just firefighting. Increased participation, so we see the beginnings of cross-functional working and working in collaboration on projects. It's much more systematic, so there's that planning that's going on, and we're beginning to plan what we're going to do, recognizing what we would like to do versus the capacity that we have in the organization. And the methods there I call it business planning deployment, but that's really essentially about planning much more effectively, recognizing the capacity constraints. Then we got continuous process improvement, and SPC is statistical process control. So in some environments, that way of measuring and monitoring processes and what you might do to drive improvements, you come out of those sort of that sort of thinking. There's obviously usually better data that is feeding all of this analysis and discussion around what we might do better. A little bit of benchmarking maybe, and we're beginning to see that rather than just beating up on suppliers, there is merit and value in working more collaboratively, at least with some of those suppliers, under the guise of supplier development. And then phase 3 has got everything that you had in phase 1 and phase 2, but there we're working much more around managing the processes. So if we're managing the inputs and the in-process measures well, as I discussed previously, then the outputs will be a lot better and maybe even predictive. And that's kind of labels phase 3. There's a lot more empowerment going on. People are being left to get on with the job, appropriately trained up and given the resources in order to effectively carry out their task. And the leadership style is much more around coaching and mentoring, so much less of the top-down approach. And the methods that are being deployed in phase 3 is systems thinking, which I'm going to go into in this series, the balanced scorecard performance management, again I'll go into that later on, business improvement planning, so planning those improvements, and to hark back to the notion of statistical process control is we want to be working on making sure that everything we do is on target with minimum variation. And why is that important? That's important because if we're managing things on target with a minimum of variation, the outcomes are a lot more predictable, and we can be of far more benefit to our organizations if we can say with confidence this is what's going to happen in the months and the next financial year to come. And then phase 4 is where all of this is so firmly embedded, you're optimizing the whole system. We call that systemic. So all the job of the Chief Procurement Officer, which I'm going to go on to in the next, or the Procurement Officer and the leadership team, I'm going to go on to that in the next video, is preceded by creating as best they can, or best we can, the right environment and the right culture where improvement is not only valued, it's expected. So there's a lot of cultural and contextual stuff to go through here if you want to develop great strategies. So that will all come together neatly as we go through this series. So thank you for watching this video, and I will see you on the next one. Bye-bye.